Welcome everybody, and a special welcome to April MacNeill. So great to see you again, April. Fantastic that we had you 6 weeks ago now to talk about trust, and you're here today to share on the importance of story. So we are really excited to have you present. For those who haven't met April before, April is a pastoral educator and supervisor at the Hunter Centre for Clinical Pastoral Education and a teacher at Sydney College of Divinity. April has over 30 years experience in healthcare and many areas of interest, including research. So welcome, April, and we look forward to what you're sharing with us today.
Thanks, Annie, and thank you to everybody for your time today. To come together and explore the importance of story. Before we begin, I'd just like us to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we are all gathered, and let us pay our respects to their elders past and present, and we extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. To move us into a place of centering and coming together, I thought I would begin with a simple blessing from the work of Jan Richardson and her Circle of Grace. Blessing the ordinary. Let these words lay themselves like a blessing upon your head, your shoulders, as if, like hands, they could pass on to you what you most need from this day. As if they could anoint you, not merely for your path ahead, but for this ordinary moment that opens itself to you. Opens itself like another hand that reaches out to gather these words in the bowl of its palm. May you think this blessing lives within these words, that let us tell you, it lives in the opening and in the spaces between us. It lives in the ache where blessings begin. It lives in the place where our hands and hearts meet. It lives in our togetherness. So in the next hour and a half that we have together, we will begin to explore the importance of story. Why is story important? And especially, what kind of stories do we hear in our pastoral work, and how might we respond? There'll be two opportunities where we will go into small breakout rooms, and you'll get the opportunity to share a story of significance for you, and also to think about what are the stories that are hardest to hear in the work that we do when we're listening to somebody else's story. So tell me facts and I'll learn. Tell me the truth and I'll believe. But tell me a story and it will live in my heart forever. All of us here today have stories from our pastoral work that will live in our hearts forever. And why? Why do they matter so much? What impact do they have on us? And what do we do with it? So Brené Brown, in her book Rising Strong, reminds us that we're actually all wired for story. That each of us seek to share our stories of struggle because we want to own them and we want to integrate them. And sharing our story with somebody, particularly with a stranger, is the bravest thing we do. In research looking at existential themes for cancer patients, we're reminded that as our world changes and our social or religious communities no longer determine how we understand ourselves, that we begin to create our own story to try and understand who we are, and in many ways justify who we are to the world around us, to the people that matter, and ultimately to ourselves. Again, it's offered that we don't so much just exchange a story, but we re-inhabit it. That our stories are dynamic living processes as we try to make sense of our experience and hold on to memory. That our stories are always relational and we share them, perhaps to enlighten another. Maybe it's to reveal something about ourselves. But stories equally can be offered to deceive, to disturb, distract, or entertain. So what do stories do for us? They're a way that we preserve customs and knowledge, the practices within our community. But they also teach us about empathy, about caring, often about how to behave. They teach us about heartbreak and love. And they give us a glimpse into the lives of the people we're caring for. The people in their stories, their worldview, their faith belief, and how they understand the world. Our First Nations people offer dreaming stories, like this story of the Seven Sisters dreaming, both told through culture, but also expressed in art. We experience our faith stories, often through sacred texts, through community, through study. But we also experience story through music, movies, literature, and the telly. And all of these stories shape how we understand ourselves. You may have favorite stories that are part of your family of origin, part of your family now, part of your workplace story. And I know for me, and this is why I included it, the movie The Castle, that was my family of origin, let me tell you. The greyhounds, the mother with the apron, the cooking of the rissoles, the aluminium tinny. And so when I look at that movie, I know straight away I feel a profound connection to me, my family, my brother and sister. And a whole flood of memories come back, purely through the sharing of a story. It's argued that storytelling and sharing our story takes us to other worlds. It gives us a sense of a different reality. And we can hear themes of growth, transformation, maybe conflict resolution. So in our first activity together, you're going to be invited to think of a story that changed your life. It may be a favorite movie or book. It may be a story that was shared through music. It may be a story that you heard at the bedside. And what I'd like you to do is to not retell the story, but I invite you to consider, after hearing that story, what did it invite you to do? How did you carry that lesson forward? Did it create a line in the sand for you about a particular issue or challenge? Did it inspire you? Or did it terrify you and you thought, I never want to live that story? So as we prepare to go into groups, and remember sharing about what impact did the story have for you. So before we explore our pastoral care and responding to other stories, let us think about a story that's changed our life. Okay, so how was that experience? Is anybody prepared to share a little bit about what they discovered about themselves, given that opportunity, or what's important for them?
No, we found it, well, I certainly found it difficult to tell a story. I think we all did, actually, about ourselves. We like listening to other people's stories.
Isn't that fascinating? I think that's so true. We're so good at listening to others. When we have to share our own, it's like, oh, do I have to? Yeah. What about for other people?
Our group sort of shared our stories, whether they came from a book or from a movie or from, the Bible or a lived experience. And then we shared sort of what we do and our reasons for it. And I felt that there was a connection there between things that had been important in the story, sometimes had quite a lot to do with where we are now.
Anyone else?
One of the themes that came through our discussion was the power of stories to impact on your life long term. Yeah. And some stories lifetime, like regrets for perhaps not understanding someone's story way back.
Yeah. They tap into our deepest emotions.
The story also that the story that was shared by the three of us, it has inspired us and it has formed us to who we are now. So
Wow.
that's just it. Thank you.
So a story you guys are going to carry forward.
Yes.
Live out, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So what about spiritual care? Spiritual Care Australia reminds us that when we're providing person-centered care, we're not making assumptions. And we're offering people the opportunity to share their experience and make meaning of it. And not only do we do that through our presence and conversation, but often through ritual and ceremony and the use of sacred texts. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the work of Ewan Kelly in his book, Personhood and Presence. And again, coming back to the pastoral response, it's that reality when we're waiting attentively with somebody, when we're listening to their path, we're actually negotiating relationships and we're co-constructing another story in that time as both the teller and the listener together. And hence why there will be stories from our pastoral practice that we can recall like that. Sometimes there'll be stories in our pastoral work that when we think of them, we can feel a deep sadness or a heartbreak. And there'll be stories in our pastoral work that have inspired us beyond belief. So Jeffrey Coulter, in his book, Stories We've Heard, Stories We've Told, again remind us that when we are faced with challenges in understanding our life, we have to make choices. We often turn to the stories, either our own or those we've heard, to ground us. And in our pastoral work, it's not uncommon to hear people recite a story of the bloke up the road when he had his cancer treatment. And he will tell the story of the bloke up the road and how that story may be informing Bill's understanding of what illness is and what cancer treatment is, and sometimes even how he will make his decision based out of another person's story. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the different kinds of stories, and I've drawn on the work of Gordon Hillsman's book, Spiritual Care in Common Terms, to unpack the different types of stories we hear in spiritual care. And I'm also looking at the work of Bezel van der Kolk in The Body Keeps the Score, specifically around trauma. And as he reminds us, it is actually through restoring the distressing events, so retelling of the story, that we first understand what happens to us. And then we begin to try and understand the significance of what happened. And in our pastoral work, we can hear this when people come into emergency departments, or when people are confronted with a sudden death or a new diagnosis. Many people that we will meet in our pastoral work have stories of trauma that they've already lived through. And it is not uncommon when we're listening to somebody's story that each new encounter, each event can be informed by the past, by the story of trauma that they have already lived through. So Hillsman offers that in responding to trauma stories, we listen to that account of the crisis from the person's viewpoint. And we clarify through our active listening what is of value. We may offer prayer or ritual, always guided by the person's needs, and support them as they plan in their immediate future. Sometimes when we meet people, they'll say, purely, I need to talk. I just know I need to talk. So how do we respond when someone invites us to have a seat because I need to talk? And sometimes this isn't necessarily the patient or the family. Sometimes that can be the staff. When we listen to stories, we can often hear stories filled with fear and anxiety. And sometimes the content of the story actually washes over us because we are immersed in the feeling between us. When we feel the fear, we sense the anxiety. And so we need to consider, how do I listen to a story, a trauma story, that has layers of fear and anxiety? What may be the best way to respond? Listening to stories with anger, resentment, and hostility can be really challenging. And sometimes we ourselves can feel quite fearful when we're listening to somebody vent their anger, vent their frustration. And yet in our work, we're invited to sit in that empathic space and maybe get a glimpse of, what is the fear? What is the need underlining this story? It's equally applicable for deep hurt. When we hear a story of deep hurt, I invite you to think, what happens to you? What do you notice not only in the other person and in their body language, in their words, in the feeling that they're expressing, but what happens for ourselves when we listen to stories of deep hurt? It's not uncommon that as people share their story of trauma, they begin to move through and share stories of empowerment. When they shared stories of how they've dealt with tough times in the past. And you know, this is what I did. This is what got me through. And what do we do when we hear people share that part of the story? It can be tempting to nod our head and go, wow. Or is there something else we can offer to help them find the resources within themselves and from their own community and support to access? Love life pain. In most encounters, what we hear are stories of love and stories of heartbreak. Stories of relationships that didn't work out, of relationships that are in conflict, of how it can even be a struggle for somebody to mention a loved one's name. And what about grief stories? I'd like to read you this little extract from Trent Dalton's most recent book, Love Stories. To give you just a little bit of background to this particular story, in 2021, Trent Dalton set up a small space on a corner in Brisbane CBD. He had a typewriter, 2 chairs, and a table from BCF. And he invited people, just strangers walking past, to sit down and share their stories of love. He actually had so many people do this. He says he has enough material for 3 books. And given all of you are predominantly from Queensland, potentially one of your stories is in his book. But I'd love to read you this story. Letting go. Who would ever do such a thing? Let go of the one you love. Let them go from your heart, from your memory, from the door of your fridge. She will never let him go. She will never stop staring at the pictures on the refrigerator. She will not protect herself from feeling of love. She will cry her eyes out when she needs to until the day she dies, and she will feel every bit of the ache of true love. She will weep, she will hurt, she will feel, and then she will breathe. And then she will dry her eyes, and then she will smile, and then she will take the frozen peas out of the freezer. So how do we listen to stories of current or recent loss? What do we do in our pastoral work? Do we gently validate those feelings? How might we use silence to allow Lucy to share her story? And what about prior loss? When we're sitting with another and suddenly they seem decades away as they reminisce about a major loss. And in our dying, how do we facilitate those stories of dying? What conversations are important for that person? What might we need for ourselves when we're caring for others as they share their stories of dying? And as I look at this right now, I'm prompted by a story in my own pastoral work about a young woman who was dying. I'd met her 10 years earlier when she was diagnosed with her leukemia. She was 36 weeks pregnant, and we sent her off to have her baby before she could start her chemo. She spent the first 4 months of her baby's life with us, having her induction chemotherapy, and then going down to Westmead and having a transplant. The first 6 months of her baby's life was nothing like what she'd imagined. And yet, you know what? She survived. And 9 years later, she walked into our ward again. And this time, things weren't, she wasn't going to be walking out. Her disease had come back so aggressively. She presented with only weeks to live. And her little boy, he was now 9. And in those first couple of encounters, she shared everything she had been through with her son. First days of school, going to cricket, watching him be so good at soccer. But as her body failed her and she deteriorated, as a healthcare team, there was a strong push for this woman to go home, to be with her son, to be with her family, and to be palliated in her home. And yet, what became clear was that was our need. It wasn't hers. And she pushed back hard. And she didn't want to go home and die. She was fully aware she was dying. And in a conversation with her, she shared her story of how she wanted to die and where that needed to be. And in listening to her story, we discovered that as for her, as a mum, the most important thing she needed to do was have her son see that she did everything possible to stay alive and to be with him. It was so central to her identity, and it was her way of expressing her love. So as a team, when we got ourselves out of the way and our assumptions about what good death looks like, we were actually able to meet her where she was at. And so, about a week later, this woman, she died down in our intensive care unit. She didn't have intubation, she wasn't ventilated, she didn't have inotropic support. There was no extraordinary heroic measures. But she ended up in that unit knowing she'd done her best to be there and to stay there with her son. It was truly transforming for all of us to know that there are so many ways of living and being reminded there's so many ways of dying. And I know from that experience and caring for her, she'll always be in my story. And I am forever grateful. Other stories we can hear are around life adjustment. And often we hear these particular stories when Sylvie came in from home after a fall. And they've told her that she's not allowed to go back to a home down the street that she lived in with Bill for 49 years. She's actually going into aged care. She needs a bit more support. So how do we hear those stories and care for her through that period of transition? And estrangement stories. They can be hard to hear. Sometimes we can feel the tension and torment, even within ourselves. How deeply do we get involved? What is our role as spiritual care or pastoral care practitioners? What is the role of our team? How invested do we get And what may our investment be telling us about ourselves? These are often interesting stories. And I don't know about you guys, but sometimes they can be the first stories that just come out as you take a seat. They don't listen to me. I don't understand anything that's going on. Why won't somebody listen to me? What's our role when we hear stories of confusion with care? Where the treatment goal and the patient's goal or their family's needs seem all over the shop, all at odds with each other. And how do we respond in that space? Stories of faith. Each of us sitting here today know they inform who we are and how we may choose to live our life. So what about spiritual practice needs? What do you do when you listen to somebody's spiritual stories, stories from their religious tradition, particularly if they're at odds to your own? What support may you need to facilitate that? And what about the stories of religious wounding? Over recent years, they seem to be coming more to light. I live in Newcastle. I've worked in Newcastle. And I am so sad to say that for our community, stories of religious wounding are everywhere. And so for part of our training, particularly at the team in the facility I worked, learning how to respond to stories of deep religious wounding, to stories of sexual abuse, became part of our training and part of our professional development. And what about those questions, those moments when you hear a concern or a wondering? I don't know what I believe anymore. I grew up believing this, but now I'm just lost and confused. What do we do when somebody shares their story of uncertainty, of doubt, of despair? Sally Longley, in her book Conversations with Silence, reminds us that often there can be a story that occurs in the silence. It may occur for those we're caring for, or it may occur for ourselves as God comes singing to us in the silence. So as we prepare to go back into group, you're invited to consider which stories are the hardest to hear for you in your pastoral work, and why. Every one of us have them. And when we come back, we'll think about, why are these stories so hard to hear? So how was that for people? Was there anything that surprised anybody?
Well, I think I'd be right in saying that 3 of us that shared in our room has had a certain amount of some of the hard stories we've found to hear actually inspired some level of anger or something in us. That you know, that if we hear a story where, you know, whatever's happened to the person wasn't inevitable, I think was the term that Peter used. You know, like some things happen, I mean, life and death, and that just happens. But other stories you hear about things that happened to people that didn't need to happen. They were either unjust or just, you know, just plain wrong, and you get that righteous anger and stuff, and that's hard to hear. I think for sure that kind of that thing a little bit. You know, this could have been avoided. It didn't have to happen. It's not necessary.
Yeah, and sitting in that space, hearing that, it's hard for everybody in the room. Because it raises so many questions, doesn't it? Whether for the other person or for ourselves. Any other comments before we move on? Thank you, guys. That's a beautiful lead-in to sort of the final part of this presentation, because that's what we're looking at. This data was gathered from people who were involved in the plane crash or survivors of the plane crash on the Hudson River. When they retold their story, they were actually asked about their storytelling experience. And they remind us that people are fully aware when the listeners are bored, disengaged, awestruck, or are shutting down. And that they continually make decisions about what is safe to share and what is unsafe to share in the moment, according to the response of the listener. A lovely quote from Sally Longley, from one of the participants in her book. The participant talked about that she loved the way that the space was provided for the wailing to happen. For when she held that in, that pain and that story, that it felt like it couldn't breathe. And that all she could do was be left to die. Coming back to Jeffrey Coulter, he offers that not only are we storytellers, but we are story holders. We listen attentively, carefully, and respectfully. That our work is involved in helping people share their experience so that they feel heard and understood. And that this provides them with the opportunity to reshape the story of their lives, maybe even into a form that is more empowering for them. From Brené Brown's Atlas of the Heart, that we are stewards of stories by our listening, our curiosity, and our affirming and believing. But there are threats to being stewards of story. And that is when the narrative, we take over the narrative, or we tap out. And when that happens, we experience discomfort or disinterest. We shut down, We may take over the narrative and we make it about us and what happened for us. Self-supervision from Robin Choate. We can always ask ourselves, what is this story telling me about my patient or client or my supervisee and their relating capacities? What's it telling me about them? And equally important, what old story of mine might I still be running that is being triggered by this encounter? Or another way of looking at it is, what ghost of the past has entered the room with me? So as we wind up, I offer you the reflection by Parker Palmer about listening to our own story. Listen to what our life intends to do with us. And let our life tell us what truths we embody and what values we represent. So our life is a story. And I leave you to think, what does yours say?
Thank you, April. Thank you for joining us again up here at QICP, and thank you that we've gathered in others from around the country. Thank you for the food for thought that you've taken us through in the last hour and a half to consider our own story as well as the stories that of those that we listen to, and helpful reminders about how sensitive the other is in terms of seeing whether we might be bored, disengaged, or shutting down, and just reminding us about our own ghosts that we bring into the room. So thank you, April, for another deeply moving and reflective presentation.